This episode, I'm joined once again by Andreas Wilmes to discuss the philosophy of René Girard, specifically in relation to the Western philosophical tradition. Please look to the first episode of this two-parter for the basics of Girardian philosophy. If you wish to support the podcast and keep everything running, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy.
So, Andreas Wilmes, thanks once again for joining me on the Hermitix podcast.
Thank you very much, James. I'm happy to talk again about Girard, and I hope in a different way, with some exclusive stuff also.
Yeah, so, this episode should be going live straight after the first one that we recorded, which was intended as a Girard primer covering the key concepts for Girard and Girardian philosophy. So once again, this one is tangentially related to the volume 1, René Girard and the Western Philosophical Tradition, Philosophy, Violence and Mimesis, published by MSU. And because of the sort of complexity and density and almost encyclopedic nature of that book, we're sort of talking around it, because that is a book obviously relating Girard to philosophy in general, Western philosophy in general. As I said in the first discussion, it's dealing with, Girard in relation to Plato, Augustine, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Spinoza, Schelling, Kant, etc., etc. Like, it's dealing with Girard. It's a long book dealing with Girard in relation to a mass of Western philosophical figures. And so to do justice to any single one of those essays or pieces is very difficult. But what we can do is have a discussion about René Girard and Girardian philosophy in relation to philosophy in general, which is a strange sort of discussion to have. It's something we touched upon in the first discussion, that the notion of Girard as a philosopher is a bit turbulent. And so that's sort of the discussion we'll be having. But the place to begin is actually with the volume itself, and really what were... So this was co-edited with you and yourself and George A. Dunn. I mean, what do you see the aims of this text being?
Well, I would say the aims are threefold. So first, there are many remarks about philosophers or philosophical movements in Girard's writings or in his interviews. And most of those comments are rather terse or enigmatic. So, for example, Girard stated that 3/4 of what he said is already in Saint Augustine. But later on, he then said that statement was meant as a witticism. He also speaks about Plato's irrational fear of mimesis, of imitation. He further evoked the cult of negativity in contemporary philosophy. So in Kojève, Heidegger, in Hegel already. He talks about Kierkegaard's superiority over 20th century existentialism. He said that Tocqueville is should be taken as the starting point of modern contemporary political science. And so, yes, you have many statements like that, and those are statements he didn't expand that much on. And what is more, you have also general comments about philosophy in itself. So already in Deceit, Desire and the Novel, he states that only novelists are able to reveal triangular desire. So meaning that philosophers are not able to do so.
Why is that? Just to expand why that point's there. Why is that? Why can't philosophers do that?
Well, he believes that philosophers are not able to do that conversion. So that death to self and opening to the other and to vertical transcendence somehow eludes the Western philosophical tradition. But we can go back to that topic later, I think. And here also has statements such as philosophy being the direct extension of the structures of the sacred, or philosophy being the, I quote him here, the continuation of mythology by other means. And so, yes, that's really the first aim of the volume, is to try to flesh out and to make sense of that reading of the history of Western philosophy, and also to try to understand Girard in a better way, I would say. The second aim, of course, is to put that reading of the history of philosophy to the test. So some chapters, like the one on Plato or the one on Spinoza, are critical towards Girard's reading of Western philosophy, while others are very sympathetic to his reading of philosophy. So like the chapters on Kant, on Rousseau, or my chapter on Hegel. And the third aim, I would say, is to see if philosophy could complement Girard's theories. So we have chapters on Machiavelli, on Hobbes, on Tocqueville, and maybe those authors help us to see how we could continue Girard's insight, or develop Girard's insight in a field he didn't talk that much about, namely politics. Yes. Or the chapter on Adam Smith. Helps us to see how we could continue maybe Girard's insights in the fields of economics. Or let's say the chapters on Kant and on Pascal. They maybe help us to see how we could talk about reason, human reason, within the framework of Girardian theory. So yes, so that would be the three aims of the volume.
Mm-hmm. Which leads us to a rather peculiar question, considering what everyone thinks they know about Girard. It's something we touched upon a little bit in the first chat. It's this very difficult position we find ourselves in with Girard in relation to the fact that his work is caught betwixt myth, religion, the sacred, philosophy, literature, and I'm probably missing some anthropology, which is really the question of whether or not I guess it's almost quite a few angles, because the question is asked and answered by various parties, which is the question of his position, whether or not he is a philosopher. So there's a question of whether or not he himself considered himself a philosopher and what he did philosophy. But then, of course, there's also the question of posthumously, and I imagine even during his day, why it is and why so many do explicitly consider him a philosopher and not say he doesn't appear to go fully in any direction. Couldn't really call him a theologian, couldn't really fully call him a philosopher, couldn't really call him a mythologist or an anthropologist. So I guess the main questions, did he consider himself a philosopher? And what, if he isn't a philosopher, what do you consider him to be, in a word, if there is one?
Well, he definitely didn't consider himself a philosopher. So the short answer is no. So Girard was a historian by training. So I would say in the 60s, he considered himself a literary critique. And after Violence and the Sacred, where he tended to consider himself, so I'm quoting him here, first and foremost, a social scientist. And you're right to say that he wasn't a theologian, so he wasn't also a Christian philosopher. So yes, he's also saying that. So I'm not a Christian philosopher. That being said, it's interesting that Girard in the 50s, so he wrote an essay in the phenomenological style. And it's an essay he never published during his lifetime. And that essay is titled Naïveté du rire, so the naivety of laughter. So it's an essay on laughter. And so this text has been recently discovered in a box of documents Girard kept. And it's now available at the René Girard archives at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. And it will be published soon by Grasset, so in French. And I know that there are currently discussions about translation rights, so it will be available in English someday. And we also know that Girard sent a copy of this text to Maurice Merleau-Ponty. So he wanted to get Maurice Merleau-Ponty's expertise on the text, but unfortunately, Maurice Merleau-Ponty never replied to the young René Girard. Why is this essay interesting? It's interesting insofar as we already see a very polemic relation to philosophy in that essay. So it seems philosophical at first because he's taking a phenomenological approach, but what he wants to do in this essay is to turn that phenomenological approach against itself. So he wants to show that the very nature of laughter eludes phenomenology. That the phenomenological perspective doesn't help us to understand why we are laughing or what we are laughing at. And at the end of this essay, he already has this idea that philosophy is unable to do that conversion that he will later talk about in Deceit, Desire, and the Novel. So deaf to self, opening to the other, and to vertical transcendence. And so it seems that from the very beginning, so there is a very polemical attitude towards philosophy. So I would say it's a thread even in René Girard's career. And so according to me, we shouldn't consider him a philosopher. So he did something else. So he did we will get the chance to talk about this, but he probably had a kind of scientific project, but with a kind of poetics at the core of this project. Yes, so that's how I would try to describe in a few words what he tried to do. Yeah.
What do you mean by poetics? How would you describe that aspect of it?
Yeah, well, we could tackle that a bit later maybe, but I mean that of course we already mentioned Deceit, Desire, and the Novel, so only novelists can reveal triangular desire. Then we have the Bible and the Gospels. So we have the biblical revelation and the Gospels, and philosophy cannot compete with that. And it's about the way language is mastered in those texts. So philosophical concepts for Girard there are limitations to philosophical concepts. So there are many things that elude philosophical conceptualization, but that poetics can grasp. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Truth for him always has a relation to something other, something elsewhere that isn't part of philosophy, which is perhaps a bit too conscious?
Yes, also, yes, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. I know you wanted to speak of, we're speaking here of Girard in relation to philosophy in particular. I know you wanted to read some excerpts from Girard's correspondence with Foucault and Derrida to sort of situate him, I guess, in relation to the philosophers of his time. So this is, it seems, I mean, as you said, the very young letter there to Merleau-Ponty. So this is a dialogue that he's always been having.
Yeah, he was it's a bit a misconception. I read it a couple of times to believe that Girard was out of touch, from all what happened at the time. So when he started to write his first books, he was already outdated almost. You read it sometimes, and that's not true at all. So he was in touch with Roland Barthes, with Michel Foucault, with Jacques Derrida. We should also say that, Girard was instrumental in introducing post-structuralism to the US. So he organized a symposium in 1966 at Johns Hopkins. So the languages of criticism and the sciences of man. So and the speakers were Lacan, Derrida, Roland Barthes, so forth. So yes, and that was the big symposium that introduced post-structuralism to the US. And yes, he was very much interested by what philosophers of his time did, but what is less known is that philosophers of his time were also very sympathetic or appreciative of his work. And I would start with the letter from Foucault, from Foucault to René Girard. And it's July 6, 1972. My dear René, now I finally read Violence and the Sacred. Slowly, meticulously, sentence by sentence. Indeed, it seems to me to be that great thing I glimpsed in Buffalo. First, a demonstration. There are two possible ways out of the infinite analysis that has been practiced for more than a decade. Imprecation, Gilles Deleuze. Demonstration, René Girard. Then, there's what I think is a radically new use of totalization. I confess I was a little wary at first. You know my flat and limited historicism. You're the first person to escape the injunction of difference and the suspicion of identity. I'd better tell you that I'm mesmerized, and I don't think I'm the only one. And that I would love to see you again and talk about it. End of the letter. It's an interesting letter, isn't it?
I mean, Foucault read a lot, so for him to say he read something slowly and meticulously is probably quite the compliment. That's my first thought. But he's also being very specific. I'm intrigued as to what he means by what do you think he means by Girard being a demonstration as opposed to Deleuze's implication?
Yeah, it sounds very negative for Deleuze, right? Implication. So yeah, so there would be a lot of things to discuss in this letter. So first he's mentioning Buffalo. This is because Foucault lectured on Greek tragedy at Buffalo University. It's in the US where Foucault and Girard met, so they talked a lot about their interpretations of Greek tragedy. So Foucault, of course, was more interested in Oedipus Rex, say, about the power-knowledge issue, and whereas Girard was much more interested about the founding murder already at that time. But I think... I think I think this means a kind of superiority of first of Girard over Deleuze. So, well, this would be the simplest way to interpret that letter. But also, there's a very deep understanding about the issues of identity and difference, because those were very important topics in contemporary French philosophy, right? And that Foucault understood that Girard has a very different position in that regard. So he speaks about the injunction of difference. And I even experienced that injunction of difference during my studies in France. So that was also a reason for me to read Girard, to go out of that, to go beyond that injunction of difference. And yes, indeed, Girard starts with the identity of human beings, and everything stems from the fundamental identity of human beings, and differences, cultural differences, are constructions. So they are not, in a way, they are not. They are not part of the primordial reality, those cultural differences. The first reality is the identity between human beings. So Foucault really saw something about the novelty of Girard's thoughts, and it's not something he really mentioned during his career, right? So we tend we tend to believe that Girard was rather dismissed, by philosophers of his time, but it wasn't the case, right?
What was the general sentiment from philosophers of his time?
Well, I would say there were two things. So calling him a philosopher was a way to dismiss his scientific ambitions. So that would be more from anthropologists, anthropologists who would say, well, he's just a philosopher, he's not doing a scientific project. And for philosophers, it was mostly, I would say, mostly silence most of the time. Well, one of the things that complicated Girard's relationship with Foucault was that a few months after that letter, Girard would publish a critique of Anti-Oedipus, right, of Gilles Deleuze's text, and it's a very it's a very straightforward and sarcastic criticism of the Anti-Oedipus, and Foucault was very displeased about that.
Of course he was.
And but Deleuze never replied to Girard's criticism. So we find maybe one sentences here and there in the seminars, but he never cared to really give a proper answer to Girard's criticism. So yes, most of them were silent. Although, of course, there are always exceptions. Like Paul Ricoeur was interested in René Girard, Michel Serres also, but Michel Serres was one of Girard's colleagues. But in France, well, in France, it was very difficult. I can also attest to that because I used René Girard during my PhD, and it was still a taboo topic. So it was very complicated to find a dissertation committee, who would agree to talk about my research. I attended I participated at a conference, for example, where I used René Girard in an anthropology conference. And as soon as I started to speak, the moderator of my panel left the room. And and he came back and he said, sorry, I had to go to the bathroom. And well, which didn't prevent him from criticizing what I did. So I don't know how he managed to do that, but yes, but it's still complicated in France. So you cannot. It's not easy to do a PhD on René Girard. So in the US, I don't know. In the UK, I don't know. But in France, it's still a controversial topic. René Girard's work.
And what about the correspondence with Derrida?
Yes. So this is all of that is from the biography of René Girard by Benoît Chantre. So all of that is available at the archives also. But that's an important point because René Girard was sympathetic to some extent, to Derrida's project of the deconstruction of Western metaphysics. And so this is something we know, although we should talk a bit more about it, I think, in academia. But what we didn't know is that they were friends in the 60s, actually, René Girard and Jacques Derrida. And yes, and the letter I took, it's Derrida to René Girard, November 9, 1967. My dear friend, I wanted to tell you that Piel sent me your text, Symmetry and Dissymmetry in the Oedipus myth. I've just read the first few pages, and it's of great interest to me. Not only for what I think is the decisive point you make about Oedipus, but also for everything to do with the scapegoat. As always, it's from the point of convergence that we understand and that we are touched. Now, I've just written 100 or so pages on writing in Plato's Pharmacy, which is surprisingly close to yours. In particular, I talk a lot about the Oedipal character of the pharmakos, who, as you know, played a role similar to that of the scapegoat. And Socrates is also a pharmakeos. Everything I'm trying to do by restoring this chain of meanings seems to flow straightly from your text. End of the letter. And this is very interesting because Jacques Derrida never acknowledged any kind of influence from René Girard on his work. So Girard acknowledged Derrida's influence, but Derrida didn't. And it's also interesting because that text, Plato's Pharmacy, is very important to René Girard. What is that text of Derrida about? It's about Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus, and the Phaedrus is a dialogue about the status of writing. So, and that writing is secondary with respect to the spoken word, And Derrida tries to show all the flows in Plato's argumentation, and he tries to show that there is a logique du supplément, so logic of the supplement in that text, so that writing is necessary to build all the conceptual oppositions, basically in that dialogue, and even broadly speaking in Plato's thought. So yeah, and so Derrida is questioning the presupposition of metaphysics of presence. So the presence, so that the spoken word would be more authentic than writing. And what is more, he tries to show that logic of the supplement, so which is always necessary to build all the conceptual oppositions in Western metaphysics, is related to the pharmakos, and the pharmakos was the sacrificial victim in ancient Greece. And so, of course, Girard saw in that text a marvelous way to expand his thought to the critique of Western philosophy, and also to inquire into the violent origins of Western philosophy.
Speaking of which, as we're quite a way in already, we have this foundation of Girard, maybe or maybe not as a philosopher, his position, also his position amongst philosophy of his day, that really begins this discussion of what are the main criticisms for Girard, because you mentioned there of Western philosophy, he's actually very critical of it via the concepts that we outlined in the first part. So this is a pretty big question, but what are Girard's main criticisms of the philosophy that we've been speaking of thus far?
Well, I would say there are mainly two. The first one is about triangular and mimetic desire. So this is something Girard says very, very frequently in his writings and his interviews, that the Western philosophical tradition dismissed very, very soon, very quickly, the conflictual aspects of imitation. And I would say this is perhaps the less convincing and less interesting part of his criticism of philosophy. Actually, the volume shows also, in a way, how Girard underappreciated how philosophers thought about imitation. Basically, sometimes the way he introduces it, it's like, well, we still have some kind of ambivalent attitude towards imitation in Plato, and then we have Aristotle, and Aristotle sees only imitation from a positive angle. And then it's over. We no longer, and this is a very reductive, if not to say wrong, reading of the history of philosophy. So if we take Spinoza, for example, so Spinoza says desire is the essence of man, right? And you have a theory about the imitation of affect in Spinoza, and a theory about desire that looks at times very close to Girard's ideas on desire. We could say the same thing for Rousseau, right? Rousseau in when he speaks about amour propre and amour de soi, there are elements that look pretty similar to Girard's mimetic theory. Same could be said for Hobbes, for many philosophers, actually. Yes, but I think the problem is that philosophers are probably very much interested in that, because that's the easiest way to criticize Girard, right? So the more interesting critique is that philosophy is unable to go back to the origins of humanity, to the violent origins of humanity. So that's the second critical angle Girard adopts.
Mm-hmm.
And that's more interesting, because it's something that deals directly with the limitations of philosophical discourse. And that's why also there's a subtitle, right, to the volume, and the subtitle is Philosophy, Violence, and Mimesis. So, mimesis plays a role, but I wanted to lay emphasis on the violence aspect, because I think that's the most interesting aspect of Girard's critique of the Western philosophical tradition.
Mm-hmm. And this critique then transforms into him understanding philosophy as you quote, this direct extension of the structures of the sacred. So how does that criticism sort of transform into this extension of the sacred? How is he understanding that?
So so we shouldn't understand it like philosophy is the same thing as mythology. So of course he doesn't mean that. What he means, however, I mean, last time we saw very quickly that mythology conceals the founding murder. It is the founding murder, but told from a distorted perspective, so from the perspective of the persecutors. And philosophy further perpetuates that miscognition of the victimage mechanism, but of course through different means, because philosophy, in contrast to mythology, is looking at is trying to build a coherent discourse. And so Girard tells us that behind that coherent discourse, there's nonetheless something which is concealed, and namely our violent origins. So yes, that's the first way to see it. There's, however, maybe something also not that negative about it, because right, for René Girard, religion has a function also. Religion is about reducing violence in society. So Girard doesn't tell us that religion is necessarily bad, right? And so he probably acknowledged that the aim of philosophy is also to reduce violence in our world, right? Of course, there are always exceptions. So we could talk about Georges Sorel or the Marquis de Sade, but generally speaking, yes, there is that aim to reduce violence in the world in the Western philosophical tradition. So yes, what he means by that is that our violent origins always elude philosophical discourse, because philosophical concepts are not adequate. They are not adequate to that task of discovering our violent origins. Yeah.
And how does that relate to the sacred?
Well, it relates to here we could take again. So of course, philosophy is no longer about sacralized violence. This is also a difference, right? So mythology directly stems from sacralized violence, from the cathartic experience of the founding murder. So philosophy is something different, but we still find traces of the sacred. And here we should connect that with what we said about Derrida, about the logic of the supplement. So the supplement is something which is not recognized by philosophers, but which nonetheless plays a role, like writing in Plato, for example, in the constitution of the philosophical system. And that logic of the supplement, Girard argues in a text. I think the text is Origins: A View from the Literature. In that text, he will try to show that what the logic of the supplement of Derrida can already be found in mythology. So philosophy is keeping traces of the sacred. So it's an extension of the structures of the sacred, but of course it's not about it doesn't directly reproduce the sacred as we see it in mythology. Yeah.
Is that what poetics does? Does poetics go in the other direction, and that's why he possibly considered it superior to philosophy?
Yeah. Well, this is I guess, the most important topic, that of poetics. What is happening during the founding murder? Well, we have that cathartic experience of violence, and we have a miscognition, and so it is a bit. We can speak about violence in the literal sense and in the metaphorical sense, right? So the violence of blows, the violence of a killing, or you can say I have a violent headache, or we can speak of violent thunderstorms, or things like that. Okay. There is a move towards metaphorization also in the founding murder, but those are different metaphors, because this is an experience of violence that we no longer can have, right, in today's world. And indeed, so the victim substitutes to the community, right, and then we substitute victims to that first victim. So that's how we continue to sacrifice people, right? And so actually the whole of culture is built on the kind of metaphorization of violence, right? They're metaphors of the crisis, also of the violent crisis, of the loss of differences. Girard talks a lot about that. So in archaic mythology, so the plague, for example, the plague is a metaphor of undifferentiation, so of the violent crisis that falls on the group, right? The plague, drought. That's why there are superstitions about twins also, because twins represent a dangerous kind of doubling of identity, right, of undifferentiation. That's why we have superstitions about someone's reflection in the mirror, right, in some etc., or menstrual blood, right? There are superstitions about that too. So at first, the whole of culture is built on those metaphors, right? And philosophy does double reduction of violence. So they first define what coherent speech should be like. And of course, there are different forms of coherent speech in the history of philosophy. So it can be first based on dialogue, then it will be the coherence, I don't know, much more later on, the coherence Kant is talking about, right? Or the coherence of dialectics in Hegel. But every time it's about defining what is coherent, and then pointing to violence as something incoherent, right? So that's something incoherent, and try to reduce it like that, and then to encourage other persons to concretely reduce violence in the world, right? Most of the time, it's like that. And so, by looking for coherence like that, philosophy is turning away from all those metaphors. But those metaphors are the main clues, right, of the founding murder. So that's how philosophy is turning away from that. And you're absolutely right to say that poetics are very important to Girard, because what do we see in the Bible and the Gospels? Well, the Bible and the Gospels, on the contrary, they will go back to the origins. So what they will try to do is they will try to understand those metaphors of violence, of our violent origins. That's why the language of the Bible is metaphorical, right? Most of the time. So Jesus using parables and so forth. The last time we saw the metaphor of the tomb, right? So this is an example of the metaphor in what Christ says to the scribes and the Pharisees. And And yes, and so the point is to use metaphors, but in a different way. Now to use metaphors to reveal our violent origins, and that topic of metaphors was always very, very important to René Girard. His very first articles, so on Saint-Jean-de-Perse and on Malraux, they already deal with that idea of metaphors. So metaphors as a way of expressing meaning, right? So he was very much opposed to surrealism, for example. Girard, he didn't like that Dadaist thing, with free association of words. So he really believed metaphors are a mode of knowledge, right, in itself. So if we master metaphors, we can access something that, philosophical conceptualization doesn't have access to. Yeah.
It seems somewhat aligned with a sort of analogical biblical approach to theory.
Yes, he has Benoît Chantre is showing in his biography that actually Girard had that idea of a methodology, and the methodology was called, it's a methodology Girard called analogical thinking. So yes, so I would say yes.
And the strange thing here after all of this is that so much of Girard is being used primarily politically. And of course, in this volume, we have Machiavelli and Hobbes. But as you say, Girard's work is largely devoid of a political dimension that we would understand as political. And so, what do you see as happening there? Is there an error in drawing what you've articulated as Girardian thought? Is there an error in drawing that into this specifically political reading?
Well, it's of course. So Girard was not a political person. So he was, I don't know. He was, for example, very supportive of de Gaulle. He was he was quite skeptic about the events of May 68. So we could give many examples. So, but you don't find many political statements in his writing. So I would say yes. It's if we use him politically nowadays, it's a mistake. It's a mistake because Girard talks about the failure of our institutions, and he doesn't take politics also as an important factor nowadays. So he rather thinks that technology is the most important factor. So again, we should compare him with Ellul, right? If we take the contemporary era. The contemporary era is that of the political illusion. So both Girard and Ellul are critiques of the political illusion. That doesn't mean, however, that we shouldn't think about politics. So of course, so Girard is talking about our violent origins and how our institutions evolve also over time. So it's a theory that should normally account for how monarchy appeared, right? How democracy appeared, and all of that. But from this angle, I think listeners will find answers in the volume, right? Because the 3 chapters, so on Hobbes, on Machiavelli, and on Tocqueville, they help us to see how we can explore those questions from a Girardian angle, let's say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is there anything you'd like to add about what we've discussed so far that you feel is key to add in?
I will add something that seems commonsensical, but still, I think it's important. I think a lot of philosophers dramatize a bit about Girard's critique of the Western philosophical tradition. So he acknowledges, of course, that philosophy played a cultural role, right, and an important cultural role. So all of what he says doesn't imply that Aristotle wasn't important, right, for logics, right, or that Locke had an influence on the U.S. Constitution, or that Descartes was important for modern rationalism, and all of that, right? It's really what he wants. He wants to look beyond culture. This is what René Girard wants to do, and it's here that we see the limitations of philosophical discourse, right? So yes, a lot of things also from the history of philosophy remain in their place, in the usual place, right? Yeah. So I think it's commonsensical, but it's important to emphasize this. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, we sort of jumped through the questions fairly quickly. I mean, what's happening with this discussion as you go into volume 2 of this series?
So first, this is the first thing I would say, because I received some emails or some comments, and people tell me, "Oh, you left aside Nietzsche, you left aside Aristotle, and all of that." So don't worry, they will be in volume 2, right? So we will have Aristotle, we will have Michel Foucault, we will have many important names, and if this will be dependent on sales, but a third volume could happen too. So, and if we have 3 volumes, I think we could cover all the major names. Yeah. Maybe I would like to focus the second volume on the questions of poetics and mythology. So that would be the angle of the second volume, right? Yeah. That's all I can say right now, because when you edit something, editing is not doesn't mean that you have 100% control, right, on the results. So you try to do the better out of what you get, right? The best out of what you get.
Mm-hmm. Well, there isn't any other questions really from me with regards to this, because we've got this together with the first part. But I guess, is there anything else you want to add about Girard, specifically in relation, his relationship to the Western philosophical tradition?
Let me think about it. Well, there would be many other things to say, right? About he has also sometimes very interesting takes on specific philosophers, but we decided not to do that, and so it's reasonable not to do that. So I would say the best thing is to for people who are interested is to take a look at the book, actually, and I might also say that you can read the book backwards. Right, so you can start with the last chapter, which is my chapter on René Girard, on his relation to philosophy, and then from Kierkegaard you can go back to Plato. Mm-hmm. The Kierkegaard chapter is very interesting because it features some of Charles Bellinger's correspondence with René Girard on the topic, and Kierkegaard is very close to Girard in some regards. And then by reading backwards, maybe you could put his reading to the test, so to see, can we from going to Kierkegaard to Plato, do we manage to go back to our violent origins, or something like that? So yeah.
Okay.
But you can read everything in the chronological sequence if you prefer, right? But there are two ways of reading the book, I would say.
Okay. Well, I'll be sure to put links for the book in the description below, and also links for our first discussion. These are sort of two were meant as a pair, so that you can probably understand the things we were discussing today in a bit more depth. But as a little overview of Girard in relation to the Western philosophical tradition, I believe that's a fairly good place to finish up.
It is, yes.
Andreas Wilmes, thanks very much.
Thanks, James.